Alright, me. It is the same day that I finished reading Siren by Catherine Linthier, and then I also finished Closer, the fourth book in the Channel series by Roger Gordon and Brian Williams. My memory is a little hazy on this because I did end up reading 3 books alongside this one as I was going through the parts. So memory of it's not the greatest. However, the reason I ended up reading a couple of the books while I was reading this one is because we've reached the critical mass point of where it's just jumping the shark to jump the shark, right? In the previous books, right, especially with Free Fall, I was like, all right, I was admitting like, hey, look, we're getting to this point in which this is not making sense anymore, right? We're introducing things just to take them away, or that we are not wrapping up things when we could. And this book really kind of jumps it, because now we have, right, I've talked about this before, of where with the other 3 books, in which I did like how they started to move between characters, but then also part of it was that the characters were relatively in the same situation or relatively dealing with, the same stuff. But now we're at the point in which, right, the world building hasn't flushed out of the world. The world building has just expanded the world. And so now you're dealing with so many other moving pieces and things that most of this doesn't make any sense anymore, right? It was, at this point, 2,000 pages ago when this was a book that was about finding an unknown world that was created by one guy and his desire for a perfect world that was just living underneath London. And now we're at the point of where there's multiple secret societies. There is like 6 different groups all working against each other in some way. There is, right, that there's just so much going on that it doesn't make sense anymore. You have the very sudden introduction of, oh yeah, by the way, in this second world that's inside the earth, there's also a surviving group of World War II Germans that very specifically say that they're not Nazis. They do specifically mention that, but really it's just because that they're too lazy and they've spent so long down there that they don't have any drive anymore, and so they don't have the anger or the fierceness to be Nazis. And it's just so wild, right? Yeah, there's just so much going on all at once, and because of that, it feels just so, it's so prolonged, it's so dragged out. This was, a series that really should have wrapped itself up in this book, I would argue, or wrapped itself up halfway through, at some point in the last book. But we still have 2 more books to go. I'm just, I don't know, and I'm just not as interested anymore as to where this is going to end up and where this is going to end going, right? And part of it just feels like it's being drawn out because it's contracted to be drawn out, and it's contracted to go for another 2 books. And it's just like, why do we keep doing this? Why do we keep doing this? Yeah, it's just, it's so far dragged out. We have characters that have start to really make their full, character cycle, and they've gone through it all, and now they're starting to become caricatures of what's expected of them, right? The entire thing of Drake has gone from being, oh, he's this renegade rogue that was living on the surface and was brought down and managed to survive after being cast aside and no longer needed, to suddenly being he's the lead of a long-standing network that has been fighting against the Sticks and the colonists. And also he's rich and really smart and has all these things and is so great and so wonderful in every single way, and nothing can ever go wrong, and he's always the best, right? It's just, it's not interesting anymore, right? It's what started off as, a chosen one type piece that was a little bit interesting because it explored some other perspectives and narratives that weren't just the chosen one, has now become a spy thriller, like a teenage spy thriller, which is kind of just right? It's also a thing that I tend to not like a whole lot when it comes to pieces of media in which they very suddenly just decide to change what their genre is in the middle of it. And eventually I get over it and it's whatever, but especially to do it in the middle of it is intensely frustrating. I watched with my friend a number of years ago at this point, when they had, what was it? It was like an Invisible Man type movie in which the girl felt like she was being hunted and stalked by an abusive ex-boyfriend. And there's like, with 20 minutes left in the movie, like she goes back home. She finally goes back home and wants to go to bed. And she's staring up in the attic, and she gets so afraid of the attic. And then she gets sent to institution. And like, that's a great way to end that movie, because the entire point, or the entire way that movie had been built up to that point, is this is what happens when you're in such an abusive relationship. They really fuck you up in a way that can sometimes destroy you. And that's like, with 20 minutes left in the movie, I was like, oh, that's a great way to end the movie. There's great symbolism there in staring up in the attic and that being her head and her brain and everything. And then it goes on for another 20 minutes in which it then becomes a sci-fi thriller in which the abusive ex-boyfriend has a nanotech suit that makes him completely invisible. And it destroys that entire movie, right? Because it suddenly decides it wants to change the genre. The same thing goes for, when I was watching through This On My Mind, because they've started to republish some stuff again through Viz Media, but with Ruby, which was originally a Rooster Teeth production. And it goes from being a, kind of young girls take on the world, but school-based, type animated show, to suddenly being this huge, massive adventure in which they're just forced out into the world, right? And it's a change in theme, and it's a change in character, not really a change in genre all that much. But it just becomes so jarring that the next season and a half, season 4 and season 5 don't look all that great as you're getting into them. And then even especially with the very end with volume 9, in which it's a fun season because it really explores the dynamics of leadership and whatnot, and this young girl that got forced into a leadership position, but at the same time it's so jarring and drastic. It's narrative and its genre change that it's hard to watch sometimes. So yeah, that's that going on. That to say, it took me some time in this book to be like, all right, fine, we'll get through this. There'll be 2 more books of young adult teen spy thriller novel, I guess. I assume that's what's gonna happen here. But yeah. God, not much else to really say about this book. It's just kind of, this book was just kind of blah. Oh, the jump the shark ending. I've completely forgot about it. I blocked that out of my head because I didn't want to think about it. This is where it's like, okay, the series is over, but we still have 2 more books to write. Of where Drake goes out with the journal from the dead Dr. Burroughs. I don't even know if I mentioned that. Dr. Burroughs is dead. He got shot twice by one of the Rebeccas. But Drake goes out with the notes from Dr. Burroughs to some professors. Professor White, who's the very first professor from the very beginning, in which stole this whatever from Dr. Burroughs. But that professor sees it, gives it to 2 undergraduates, and has them, the 2 undergraduates, write a book about it. And it turns out that the 2 undergraduates wrote the Highfield Mole, which is the original name of the first book, Tunnels. It was originally called The Highfield Mold. And it's like, it's so self-referential, and it's so jumping the shark of where now you have these 2 authors that have now directly inserted themselves into the world and say that their own books exist within the world that is being described. And it's just so wild, and it makes it's so jumping the shark. It makes absolutely no sense except for this kind of throwaway gag. And I bet that they're going to include it some way in the other 2 books. But yeah, this is, I'm going to get through them during Thanksgiving break, which starts tomorrow. And I will get through them probably on some margaritas. And we'll be all right. We'll be okay. And then I can start getting back to some other of these massive pile of to-be-reads that I need to finish. So that's that. That's Closer. Roderick Gordon, Brian Williams.